Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Father Boquet, our president. Welcome back, Father.
Well, Colleen, great to be with you once again.
It's great to catch you in between mission trips. I feel like I say that every time these days, but mission travel has been pretty busy, it seems like.
It has been, and a few more things for the rest of the year. So God willing, and they all fall into place. But it's exciting. It's wonderful. That's what we exist for.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you've had some really good trips lately, and maybe once you get back from this coming one, we'll have to do an episode or something.
That'd be wonderful. I think
going through.
Our listeners would love to hear kind of what's going on in the mission field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. To hear some nice stories that you have and all of that. So keep an eye out for that episode. Today, we're going to be following up on some episodes you did with Tad like over 2 years ago when he was hosting the podcast. So back before I came on board, you had an episode called How to Talk About Contraception with Contracepting Christians and How to Talk About Contraception with Contracepting Catholics. And today I was thinking that we could pivot slightly and talk about how to talk about contraception with secular friends and family. So people that aren't necessarily coming from a faith perspective where you have to use more of natural human reason to be able to talk about these topics. So I guess my first question today is this something that should be talked about with people that aren't Christian?
Well, it's a wonderful subject because it's affecting, so many people globally. So as we just started talking about the international mission field, but this subject, this topic, the issue of contraception affects people across our planet, whether they be Christian or non-Christian. Mm-hmm. And it's an important topic to keep bringing before people for their reflection. So yes, you can speak and should speak, and we ought to consider, how we address, the topic in different environments among different peoples coming from the topic from a very different perspective. And especially as our culture, Colleen, has become more secular and not necessarily looking or wanting argumentation from a religious perspective, that how do we enter in? So the answer to the question really is, and I brought with me today a wonderful book that I've used before here in our podcast, and it's really the foreword written by Cardinal Burke, and it's called Inseparable, and it's from Catholic Answers, and I do use it quite often because it's actually filled with many stories from people, who are one, either trying to understand, the topic itself, why contraception, why does the church teach what she does, and then also how do people come to realize this truth and say, wow, what have I been missing? And so that's what I'm going to use today. That's a way to answer some of your questions today. And
I think to go back to the first question that I asked too, we should talk about it because it's been seen for so long as the Catholic issue, contraception's a Catholic thing, and just it is grounded. It's natural law, which means that it's grounded in reason, and so you can help people kind of reason from the ground up.
Exactly, and there's ways of approachment, that different people will be open to and receive much more easily, So what I thought we'd do is because, and the answer is from that natural perspective, is because we're part of a human family, and as a result, as human beings, we approach these topics, from that perspective. How does it affect me, as a human being? How does it affect the common good? How does it affect my family, my marriage, my family life? Those are the questions that affect whether we Christian or not Christian, and that's where we're starting. So I'm going to use a chapter here, from chapter 4, and it's written from Jessica and Sean McAfee, if I'm pronouncing their last name correctly. And so God forgive me if they happen to be listening. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name. But here I'm going to use really Sean's comment, because he speaks about this, and that's why it gets to the natural point. He says, others believe that sex was only for creating babies and not at all for physical pleasure or unity. In fact, some taught this type of pleasure was sinful and to be avoided and repented of. So he's reflecting in this kind of going back and forth between Jessica and Sean of what his thoughts were, why he thought people thought the way they did. Then he says something that really gets to the question. There was also those who believed a woman should never say no to her husband, lest she fail at being a good and submissive wife. Furthermore, if she were to refuse his sexual needs at any time, she was giving a foothold to the devil to come tempt her husband with pornography, and he just goes on. So when you read through it, what Sean is getting to is that as people approach the subject, they're looking at it from, a single point of view, and so as he came to understand, he realized that how do I respond to my wife as a man? How does my wife respond to me? And also, what's the good for both of us? What's the good for our marriage? What's the good for our relationship? And what's the fruit of that relationship? Now, that's something I can discern naturally.
Mhm.
And by conversing with my spouse and talking to them and getting a feel for what they feel and understand about the sexual act. And what does this really mean? And is it really just about, quote, having babies? Is it really about singly just having pleasure?
Mhm.
And so these are natural questions that, every couple is asking themselves in some way or another
Mhm.
around our world, whether they be Catholic, Christian, or non-Christian. So I think what Sean does is he opens up the kind of the basket for us to look at. And so how as a human being do I act? How do I respond to, and as he gets a little further in, he says, what about discipline? Am I supposed to act in a disciplined kind of way? Am I always, because I have an urge, to act on that urge? How does
Mhm.
that affect my wife? What does that mean for her? Maybe who's not feeling well. Maybe she's up all night long taking care of our firstborn child. So it does have an impact. So he's looking at it really just from that practical daily application.
Mhm.
And then as you dive a little deeper into the stories, and then you find out, okay, now what are the consequences if we were to employ contraception, whether it be hormonal,
Mhm.
whether it be through a barrier method? What does that mean? And
Mhm.
how does that affect our relationship? Does it affect our relationship?
Yeah.
So these are the ways that Catholic Answers in his book on the topic is trying to come at it from different perspectives, but also allowing couples in this regard to talk about it. What brought them to the truth
Yeah.
that contraception is not a good
Mhm.
for our marriage, for me as an individual, for my wife, for us as a couple, for our family.
Mhm.
So,
Okay, then maybe we can just walk through like a couple different angles that you could approach this topic from like the
mhm.
natural reason perspective. So maybe starting with relationship issues. How does contraception hurt a couple's relationship?
Right. So obviously, we as we've had many conversations before in
Mhm.
talking about the subject, even for those that are not necessarily in line with our Catholic principles,
Mhm.
but from just that, again, that practical, natural reasoning that one can discern is there's always a consequence to every act.
Mhm.
And so in this situation for a couple is to ask themselves, so what is the good that we're trying to achieve here? That's to me the starting point of a conversation.
Mhm.
And listen to that and then back that up and say, now, how, in a sense, does contraception, quote, either answer that need
Mhm.
or how does it harm that good that you're trying to achieve? So if I don't understand that I actually act through my body, I
Mhm.
respond to others as a body person. And because they are a body person, they're responding to me. Now, in marriage, that's a very different relationship. And so the fact of that we're not just a body, we
Mhm.
are a rational being. We can choose to act or not act. We can choose certain behaviors and certain things we can discern that might be harmful to the other person. So as I know we're going to get into a little bit, when you look at hormonal contraception,
Mhm.
obviously there are consequences of that we can very easily come to understand through science and what the medical journals and what we can ascertain through many, many studies on hormonal contraception. We
Mhm.
can talk about why an IUD and what is the issue that how does that function, and then what are the consequences of using an ID long term, short
Mhm.
term? Does it stop a pregnancy from occurring? How does hormonal contraception, for example, affect my wife in a
Mhm.
sense of so that maybe we're not open to abortion. We don't believe abortion is something good at all. We are opposed to it.
Mhm.
And so, does hormonal contraception is it an abortifacient? So those are the kinds of conversations that are easy to have to
Mhm.
really stretch someone's thought about this act, this decision that we're considering. But
Mhm.
the realization is that because it affects my body, it affects the other person's body. And one can say, well, it really affects her more. Well, that's also part of the argument here. She's the one that has to endure the long-term effects of of contraception, whether that be hormonal or
Mhm.
whether that be through some of the barrier methods or an IUD or an injectable. And so what does that mean long term for my wife? How is that going to affect her physically,
Mhm.
mentally?
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that couples that use contraception are more likely to divorce as well. Everybody wants a healthy relationship. So could you talk a little bit to some points you could bring
Sure.
up about how contraception hurts
I mean, there's
relationships?
been, Colleen, so many studies on how, because we're not just talking about the act of contracepting or the use of a contraceptive.
Okay.
It's also the mentality that goes with that
Mhm.
really does affect, because again, now here bringing in such a Catholic perspective, what St. Paul VI in Humanae Vitae on human life spoke about. He kind of prophesied about the consequences that could occur if this contraceptive mentality becomes really entrenched. And one of those was how men would treat women. So now we're not just talking about men treating single women alone. We're talking about how men would approach women, no longer seeing her in her complementary relationship or in a sense of a gift to each other, and how through the sexual act and conjugal love, again, here we're talking about in marriage is where this act is only to be utilized in a sense and shared. But if a person approaches that by, as Sean says, that, it's I have a need, you have to give me what I need. Well, that is a mentality. That's a framework, and it becomes a usury. It becomes, in a sense, that she no longer is seen, as one who is complementing, one who is equal in dignity, one who I approach with love and care and sensitivity. Now, Sean would obviously tell me that he never thought anything ill, obviously, but the idea is, how does that emotionally, and even though we're not speaking spiritually, how does that spiritually affect Jessica in this case? How does she walk away from that moment? How does she feel? What does she feel like? And what Paul VI said is this usury, this objectification of someone, treating them as an object, for my own gratification. And being a priest now 31 years and having sat in many moments of counsel with couples, actively living their Christian faith, not living their Christian faith, living more of a secular life, I can tell you, I hear so many times, the difficulty when this mentality gets in, and it's wives that are the ones that are concerned and in some way complaining because they feel that they're like an object, that purely just there, because this person has so need. And I'll tell you, and the majority will say, I know he cares. I mean, but this is the mentality it creates. Now, that's something that even a non-Christian man can discern. Why is my wife distant to me? When I approach her, why does it seem that she's not engaged, not part of? That's easy to discern if a person is willing to ask the question, and they do, because I do hear it. And so there's many ways that we can approach the subject and it starts by, again, I go back to what I began with, is by listening to the couple and listening to why they would be opposed, or why they would think contraception is a good, by listening to what they believe they're seeking, what they believe they want, and does this actually help you obtain that? And then helping them with that, what if you choose this act? Have you thought about the consequence of that? So again, for the couple that says, hey, I'm not interested, we don't ever want to participate, in an abortion, or do we believe that we would ever abort our child? But then to learn that hormonal contraception, and many of these are abortifacient and do have an impact. They're surprised when they hear that because no one's ever discussed that with them. Or to hear, and by using Paul VI and just talk about that treating a person as an object, and he said, well, I would never do that. And then you hear her pause and, do I treat you that way? She says, well, and so all of a sudden it opens a conversation. I never meant to do that to you. Well, I know you don't. But all of a sudden she's now able to talk. And so it does affect people, and then that mentality finds its way again where it becomes purely only on the level of a physical gratification, which love and conjugal love is so deeper than that, so richer than that, so much more beautiful than that. And so that's what many times when you hear couples who come out from under that mentality said, my goodness, I can't believe we've done that for so long. Look what we've been missing,
I was listening. Well, this is going slightly into my next point, which is the health problems. But I was reading Dr. Sarah Hill's book, Your Brain on Birth Control, and she is secular. She isn't actually opposed to contraception. She's opposed to hormonal birth control. But she was reading it, and she was saying that when she went off the pill, she was like, it was like I woke up. She was like, I didn't realize what a fog I was in until I went off of it, and then I woke up. And that was I'm about halfway through it, and it's been a fantastic read just to be able to look at the biological things that are going on, to be able to explain that. Because again, if you're able
Right.
to talk about this from the practical reason perspective of, hey, biologically, this is what it does to you. These are the benefits of like not being on hormonal birth control. Then
Correct.
you can kind of begin to walk people towards an understanding of like, okay, if you get them to understand that
Right.
maybe hormonal contraception is an issue, then you can walk them the next step and you
Correct.
keep walking them up.
Exactly. That's what Dr. Janet Smith, in Contraception, Why Not? I mean, so when you read, this, which has been around now for several years, but Dr. Smith has been, so much in this conversation for so long and so rich in her contribution. But, every once in a while I pick it back up again because it's just so rich. I mean, it's so much there. And there is a section in there. What are the consequences of that medically? And so, and I know in our mission field at times, because where we see contraception so imposed, as some great good, and then when you sit down, and I just tell one quick story, I remember, women in Entebbe in Uganda. We had gathered together, to listen to them, and these women had such a difficulty even walking. Many of them were on multiple contraceptives, oral contraceptives, some also with injectables. I won't go through the litany of all their suffering, but I mean the idea of just physically what these chemicals have done to them. And so, and as you said, and Dr. Sarah does get into, once I can bring you to understand the harm, now let me bring you to the fact that a barrier, even though there's no chemical involved, there's still a harm being done. And what's that harm? And now they're more open. They're much more receptive. And then when you talk to, especially women, and you say, how do you wish to be treated? How do you wish to be honored and respected? How would you like someone to respect you physically, emotionally? And as we know, again, we can enter into that because women typically do not compartmentalize their feeling from what they're expressing or from what they want in physical relationship, an emotional relationship, and a psychological relationship. It's whole. It's a oneness, and so that can actually, it's a way to enter in, because men can sometimes be very compartmentalized in how they approach different subjects, and this is one subject that they can very easily compartmentalize, and like Sean says in the kind of the point, I just have a need, respond to it. Well, no, this is not the way we do this. And so I think there's, again, by talking about the data, what have we learned from medicine? What have we learned, from what the pharmaceuticals say about their own product, that many people have never read, the long 6-foot, page that's very, very small in print that 5-year-olds can only read because their eyes are so perfect, but it's there. It's clearly outlined, these consequences, but most women are never told, Colleen.
Could you walk through a few of those health problems that we have other episodes talking about it more in depth, but just like off the top of your head, a few of the ones that you know of?
Sure. So what we share, like what I experienced in Uganda, I'm going to give you an example. You had the fact that their appetites changed, either from the point of being not being hungry at all to actually always being hungry. We saw, a number of women had body hair that they never had before. You had, again, what you already mentioned, this kind of fog, this kind of inability to process and to think. And it affects each woman differently because each woman is different. And so, but also the very fact that it can cause, heart issues, blood pressure issues, it can cause possible embolisms, it can cause cervical cancer, uterine cancer, long-term usages. So there's a list. And that we can go through that I know that we can put up on our link in our web in our notes.
We've done some episodes on them already before, so we don't have to rehash the whole thing.
Right.
I just thought it was an important thing to bring up, that this is a talking point that you can use.
Exactly, and realize a man doesn't suffer with any of it. So who suffers, from the consequence of use of oral hormonal contraceptive? Who's the one that really has to bear, quote unquote, that burden? And so I think when you stop and you think about that, now of course that can lead to other conversations.
Devil's advocate argument. The woman also bears the quote unquote burden of pregnancy. So how would you respond to that? Right.
So we know pregnancy is not a disease. And so it's very important for people to see, and there's never, ever a legitimate reason to end a pregnancy through abortion. So but here again, you can also move men to say, well, then, okay, I'll go be sterilized. So you can have an opposite impact. And that's also happened because some women will say, I'm not doing any of that. you go get yourself taken care of. So so you can see how, it does affect men if they stop and think about, because their actions affect the people they love. And it affects also their understanding of family, right? So I have met, but normally under most couples are open to wanting children. Now today that's changing very tragically and sadly in our anti-family culture that's being pushed by ideologies and ideologues and so forth. But it's sad because there's a natural desire, for the begetting of children, and every conjugal act is the potential possibility of a third, and that's also affects how people think.
How would you respond to a woman who says that she would rather take hormonal birth control and deal with all the physical side effects than deal with, quote unquote, deal with a pregnancy?
Right.
Like, to her, the physical effects of like having to take care of a child for 9 months outweigh the like daily brain fog from birth control. So how would you respond to a woman who's in that situation, who's challenging you in that way?
Having been in some of those moments, sometimes again, it's listening, asking just questions. What's kind of brought this thought? Why do you feel this way? And just being able to accept it, able to hear it, and and to respect where she's coming from, and just listen to it, and then respond, to what her reasonings are, and being able. And sometimes, Colleen, there's nothing you can say. That there is, in a sense, there is a mindset that's set, and you plant seeds, you offer. What I've suggested is that so the fear of welcoming a child. Why is that fear there? There's a reason for it. And it's important to listen to those fears and be able to then speak to them. And sometimes the fear is the fact that they feel alone. They feel that, will my spouse support me? Will the potential child, in my family, there might be a history of some genetic difficulties. There are fears. To listen to them and respond to them. I'm serious. I mean, in a sense, it's rare that I've met, Colleen, people that are just so completely 100%, closed. I have met people that are, quote, closed, but when you talk to them, they think they're 100%, but you listen to them, they're not. They have created a reasoning, but they got to convince themselves of the reasoning. And sometimes it's basically based in an ideology. They just believe that some people today fall into the trap of believing the world's overpopulated. They believe the issues that the world around us with the climate issues that people are all talking about, it sets a fear and anxiousness. Those things are real. And so, but by talking to them and expressing, just like we do in a way, and it's not the same, but there's a similarity when a woman with child is concerned about the child within her. Can she care for the child? Where do I go? She feels alone, maybe unsupported. So there's a way of, again, how do we argue those? And I say argue, how do we address those? How do we speak to those? How do we reach out to her? How do we help her to know that she's not alone? So I think just individually, that's been my practice.
Yeah, no,
so
that makes sense.
it's again, on interviews, we're doing now, and I always am very complimentary of our Catholic radio programs because they're on a daily basis. So what we're doing today really, in a way, could be a series. In a sense, if you had 4 days in a row, we could break each one down and be able to talk about it. But my experience really has been by just listening and then speaking to it. And so that, because I only might have that one moment. I may only have that one conversation. So that's how I've approached it.
Well, that's why I wanted to bring up like a few different angles that people could approach this from, because like you're right, it's going to depend on what the individual couple that's contracepting, what their reasons are. So it's similar, like you were just making the comparison to a woman who is like going to a pregnancy care center and doesn't know if she wants, like, can keep the child.
Correct.
And I mean, she can, but
right. But she doesn't think she can.
She doesn't think she can.
Right.
Yeah. And so it's like, okay, you might know like different pro-life talking points of how to help her choose life, but you have to like listen to her and figure out the best way to help her understand those and which is going to be the best approach. And this is kind of a similar thing where you have a couple that doesn't necessarily understand what God's plan is for conjugal love. And so helping them recognize what are your fears, what mindset are you coming from, and how can you address some particular issues. So I just kind of wanted to hit some of the more common
finances
points.
is another one. Oftentimes, people, like their lifestyle. Sometimes that's the issue. They really enjoy being able to travel, move around and, be able to buy and just enjoy life.
Mhm.
And so sometimes the way to approach that is, but, that's short-lived.
Mhm.
It's but the beauty and wonder of fatherhood and motherhood, to be able to, and it is, and I think that's part of the language is the risk,
Mhm.
because it's the unknowns that often scare people the most.
Yeah.
The unknown of that child. What will that child be? What will the personality be? What are the demands this child will have of me? The sacrifices I'll have to make. But like any great journey
Mhm.
is worth, and that's the part to me is to encourage them to let go of the fear. But again, I know we're talking about the issue of contraception, and again, people often think that this is a way to manage,
Mhm.
so they kind of using it as a management. But the realization is, we know that in the United States, for example, now these statistics change and they have changed, but for well over how many pregnancies occur even while on a contraceptive or the
Mhm.
use of a contraceptive. And for many reasons, the failure rates, the lack of usage, or the fact of not taking it every day. I mean, there's all these things. So
Mhm.
all of a sudden now they're faced with a pregnancy.
Mhm.
What do we do? So these are also part of how to argue that, but the idea is that, that instead of approaching it from a fear and the realization that there could be a possible failure or something, is welcoming life, being open to life, and being able to respect each other and to honor each other, and to see the welcome of a child as and it's this great adventure, and to build a family and to see how the family is part of society and
Mhm.
part of the good that you're also contributing to.
Mhm.
Not from a consumption and appropriation kind of manner, but
Mhm.
from the very fact that a child brings a gift to this world. Every child does. The uniqueness, the beauty, the wonder, and who knows what that child will bring into this world. And
Mhm.
and you're a part of that, to see that,
Mhm.
and not to be limited even to number, but to always be open. But that's again how you build the conversation. But you got to find an entry point.
Yeah.
It's an entry point. And oftentimes, I mean, on airplanes, I've had people ask me, Colleen, this question.
Yeah.
So yeah, now sometimes, unfortunately, they might regret asking the question because you're stuck with me on an airplane for 5 or 6 hours, but I'm amazed because one day, and it's just recently, that the two rows around me were the groups were turned toward me, and the three in the back were over the seats I was sitting in, which again, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes, people can be quiet, but
Shh.
the young woman in front of me asked a question. And it was in because I think the young lady sitting next to me was part of their group, because it was three young women
Okay.
and this young woman.
Yeah.
And then I don't forget who it was, a gentleman on this side of me. But then apparently the couple behind me were also part of it. So they just kept asking questions.
About contraception?
Marriage, contraception, why does the church teach about that? What's
Mhm.
what's the point of that? Why is it so opposed?
Mhm.
And so now, granted, it wasn't just those 6 people, well, actually 9 people
Mhm.
that were now dealing with this. It was everywhere else. So, but it was interesting that they were willing to ask and they were
Mhm.
honest,
Mhm.
and some of them were single, and some even admitted they were in relationships,
Mhm.
as single people, and that's why they were. I don't want to be a mother now. I don't want to be a father now. So they're. But then my point was, well, what happens if you do?
Mhm.
And that just makes them think for a moment, So consequences. So we just talk it out, and it was amazing. So you do get these kind of questions from a large pool of people that may or may not be religious in their mindset. They may not be practicing any particular aspect of their faith.
Mhm.
May themselves not even be baptized.
Mhm.
But even having a conversation with our Jewish brothers and sisters.
How would you respond to a couple who says that they only want to have maybe 2 or 3 children so that they can, best take care of those 2 or 3, and I don't know, maybe grew up in big families and felt overlooked, or
Mm.
just didn't see they don't want to have a big family because they want to bestow like all of their energy on just like 2 or 3 kids. How would you respond to them?
Yeah, that's always a difficulty, because they as all things, people walk in with a mindset.
Mhm.
They walk in with a very kind of a boundary set around their rationale. So
Mhm.
again, it's by listening. Tell me a little bit about why you feel that way.
Mhm.
What are the, because ultimately it comes down to a fear,
Mhm.
fear of not having enough resource, fear of not having enough a place to live. Do I need a bigger house? Do I need to get more car space? Do I get a second car? How do I pay for college? How do I pay for a wedding? All those things are wrapped in there, even though we're talking about two toddlers right now, but they're thinking, they're trying to process because everything around them pushes them in those directions. And sometimes people do come out of wounded situations in life. Their experience of family life, not always the most positive. The lack of a mother, the lack of a father in the home, abusive situations. People are affected by all this. And so presenting a different model to them seems foreign to them. And that's why oftentimes they just close up because you're just opposed to contraception. In reality, it's opposed to a different narrative. I have a very different anthropology and how I approach the human person as a spiritual being, as a body person. How do I see? How do I respond as a body person? How do I act toward others? Acting through my body, with my body. That's who I am. And so they just kind of close that kind of off. And so when you open up the conversation, and then sometimes I just start by saying, yeah, my dad is one of, my grandfather was one of, and they're shocked. Well, how could they do that? How is that possible? I said, my question always is, or my point to them is, do you think their hardship was any less? Do you think their difficulties of raising a large family, were any less than what it would demand of you? It's all about how you see the beauty of family life and the possibilities of life and what each child will bring to your family and contribute to your family and how you are to be a steward of those goods. And to realize that, no, the church doesn't teach it. You just quote unquote, I don't like using the word have. And I just don't like the word. And I do use it, unfortunately, at times, forget myself. But I'm just going to say, constantly just be welcoming children. The child has rights too, to come into a stable environment, to be welcomed by mom and dad, and to be not assured of all the niceties, but to be assured of a stable home, a safe place, a place that they're welcomed and loved and cared for. And so it's a mutual question that needs to be asked. And also I always would say, don't you think your own children would welcome a brother and sister? Do you think they would love to be able to share, time and their own gifts with others? And we, it's kind of ironic that we were talking just with our staff just the other day, Colleen, about, being the firstborn and being the last, and how sometimes the ones that's the last doesn't have any more children behind. And they kind of feel, especially if there's an age gap between them, they're lonely. They're looking for someone to play with. So these are the kinds of ways to enter in. And I know it's not answering your question directly, but that's how I've approached this in my conversations with people, because there's no one answer. I know what our church teaches, and I know why she teaches it. And I believe, whether from the natural law perspective, from our Christian principles, it's all correct, and it makes perfect sense, and it's rational, and it's based in an authentic science and an understanding of humor. I know that. Many times they don't.
Yeah.
And if I come in as a steamroller and just kind of roll over them, I'm not going to get anywhere either. And they're just going to close themselves further. And it's interesting, again, we were in our conversation, we were talking about, Dr. Scott Hahn and Kimberly Hahn, and how their journey to the faith came, and really how Kimberly herself, investigating the issue of contraception, she's the one that that approached that subject and addressed Scott with those issues. And so it takes an openness, even sometimes being opposed to it, but to be open to truth. And the realization is, oh wow, I didn't know that. And so sometimes people can approach it from science, from the effects, the consequences, the natural results, and that's your foot in. Sometimes people can approach it from that relationship part. I never thought about that with my wife. I would never want to harm her. I never thought of that. I'm sorry. And you talk to her and say, I never thought I was doing that. I'm so sorry. So, or for her to say, I wish I'd have shared this with you long ago. I'm sorry I kept it from you. It opens up the relationship to good communication, which contraception removes, because you don't, quote unquote, have to worry. But yes, you do, because there are consequences to it. And it is not natural. All right. It imposes an unnatural reality upon which should be a natural expression of husband and wife. You're placing a barrier, or you're interrupting a natural act that should have an end. And what does that end look like? These are the kinds of ways of entering in to the conversation. So whether they're Christian or non-Christian, they're human beings.
I think you just kind of began to answer what was going to be my next question, just kind of probably to close it off with this one, because I think this might be a little bit of a long answer. Maybe not. Maybe you'll have a short one.
Me?
Is there a good way to give a defense that every conjugal act between a husband and wife should be open to life from a purely natural reason?
So from a natural perspective.
Yeah, so not like, oh, it needs to be open to life because the church says so, or because this is what the religious teaching is about God's plan for marriage, but just purely from this is using reason and using looking at marriage from a natural perspective.
If we look at the sexual act, so what is its, in a sense, without any type of interruption, without any type of introduction of anything to prevent, what is the potential always the beginning of a child? Always. So it doesn't mean a child will be begotten every time, but it means that this act, if left to itself, in other words, to its natural end, the potentiality of a third person is always there. So immediately in the mind is the very fact that this act between myself and my spouse always has that potential. That's how I often enter in. Because that is, because when you remove an interruptus, when you place, you're doing something that is not natural. You're doing something that is opposed to the finality of this act. And the fact, so just on that level alone, is that to think about that, by interrupting the act, by preventing its act from its finality, and think about it, there is a finality. There is something that, in a sense, both in the male and in the female, that is part of each other in their own anatomy and own physiology. That if left to its natural end and things as they are, then there is the potential that he will donate his seed into her womb, and the potential of that act is the beginning of a child. And so, for me, that's in a sense. So by bringing these things that are outside of that act, you're changing the act. You're changing the intent of the act. So that's not just a Catholic principle. I mean, it's just the idea that you're doing something to prevent something. So if you have to prevent it, it means there's something that should naturally occur. But you're preventing it. You're stopping it from happening. So the question now, why you're stopping it from happening? And that's where the entry point becomes. And you start talking. That's how I've approached this. Sometimes, now, I'm not going to do it on this microphone. Sometimes just being a little more blunt with them and just talking about the sexual act. I'm not going to do that on the microphone and for the interview. But that's because they think sometimes that, that because we don't talk about sex, we don't talk about the sexual act, we don't talk about the pleasures and the beauty and the wonder of it, and that they're made for each other. That male is made for female and female is made for male, and that this union is made for each other, and they can only accomplish the end together, right? And so that's why, now from the Catholic perspective, why self-gratification is always considered sinful, because it's not made for the person alone. So these are the ways of entering in. And a lot of times that's how you enter with our Catholic families, because no one's ever had that conversation with them. And because, as Father Marx used to say, that in a sense that it's generational too, because, parents pass this on, sadly. One, not always because of the number of children, because sometimes there's a natural impediment that why families had only one child or so forth. But in many cases, they find that their parents themselves adopted a contraceptive act and mentality. So they kind of grow up in that and pass it on. And in this culture today where you just turn around every door and billboard and ad and so forth, everything is being pushed in that direction. We have really harmed, and I think that's what I would want to end with, is the harm that's been done. to young people, to young adults, to generations of people now, since the introduction of, quote, the pill that really so-called made people free. It's actually made people enslaved and changed the way that we approach marriage, the way that we approach sexuality, the way that we approach self-discipline, modesty, how we approach abstinence, virginity, purity. All these things have changed.
Yeah.
Because of this introduction. They were always a threat there, always. And I think people need to realize, even from the natural point, that up until 1930, that all Christian communities held a principle that contraception was opposed to marriage. Yeah. It was a violation of marriage. And so obviously that introduction of change has now brought about a cultural change, not for the good. No. Not for the good. Our broken homes, our broken families, high divorce rates. We have people that are suffering from long-term use of chemical contraception, and no one wants to talk about the connections like Dr. Lanfranchi would talk about with the connection to breast cancer, cervical cancer.
We have an episode on that.
No. So these are the kinds of things that help people. Now, I would say this, and maybe just a way of tossing it back, and it's something we can come back, Colleen, and always talk about, is we have the other side of the equation that often happens. That let's say you win the conversation, you kind of get them to see your side, and then all of a sudden they want to use the church's teaching, let's say with regard to natural family planning, as a natural contraceptive. Because now what they've done is they changed, the mentality still is there, contraceptive mentality, and now they want to introduce it into using only natural things, in other words, learning their cycle and so forth. That's a danger there too. So that's a different moment when you talk about, but that can sometimes happen too, where a very healthy woman says, I'm not taking anything hormonal. I'm not wanting to participate with any type of barrier, any type of other things. I will just follow my natural cycle, learn that cycle, and realization that it does work if it's followed. And, so that's how many, but that's a contraceptive mentality. She still doesn't want a child.
Yeah, so she just wants the more green, crunchy way to go
right. So that's a different conversation, and for a different moment. But that could be the turn that someone could take.
So just to clarify for our audience, that is wrong. Using
exactly,
NFP for a
absolutely
contraceptive mindset. Yeah, that's actually how I've seen there's been a lot of like Instagram, like the Crunchy Mom Instagram account kind of things, like to try to wean people off of birth control and being like, these are all the problems with birth control, but then they just replace it with NFP. So,
yeah. And what we do in our mission field is just a way, is to say that, we make it very clear in all of our resources and how we approach. I keep those subjects always separate from each other. And I don't tie them into the same conversations, and I actually at times try to keep them on separate days in our workshops and in our symposia to keep it disconnected, so that we try to keep people from making the leap and thinking, well, then this is just an alternative. No. So you have to teach people why, is NFP, what is that? What does it mean? Now to that, to a person in the natural world, in the sense of not in a religious perspective, you have to bring them into understanding, the beautiful teaching of the theology of the body. And you have to bring them into understanding what is conjugal love, what is the conjugal act, why should this only be expressed and experienced in marriage. So you might have a couple that's living together, so how do you bring them into this conversation? And we see that in the mission field sometimes, Colleen, because what we'll experience is, because they don't know, no one's ever spoken to them, they may actually be living in a cohabitative situation, so how do you help them to see that this is not right and why? And then all of a sudden the realization is, wait, it means I shouldn't be having any sexual relationship with this person. Yes. And why? So these are all part of, and then of course, when you realize in that cohabitative situation, there are no children, you don't see them. So now you realize, obviously, there is contraception involved, and oftentimes it's injectables in the mission world, that type of thing. So those are for different moments, but it does show you why it's not just a U.S. conversation.
Oh yeah,
that this is a human conversation, because we're dealing with human beings all over the world, and if anything else, what makes this so natural is because we're dealing with human beings. We're made as a social being, and as social beings, we are drawn toward others. And in particular, those called to the marital life, there's that natural draw. And it's there. It's always there. And so, and for some like myself and that, have been called to a vocation of life, it's not walking away from something because it's bad. People often say, no, because my vocation is here, but that's still, it's because there's something good here. There's something beautiful here that I'm being asked to be able to surrender in order to serve this other good and to serve that good. So it's just, there's so many ways of approach. And I think I'm glad we did this, because I'm hoping our listeners will hear that. And also that from my perspective, at least as a priest who cares about people, is to be sensitive to where people are. And so even as we're doing this is an interview, and it can be used and will be used, and maybe pick different parts out, and I think if we come across any kind of harshness, it closes doors. But when we have an honest conversation with our church's teaching, why she teaches this beauty, and that's why, because it's beautiful, it's a good, why we want our non-Catholic Christians to understand, which they one time did hold the same, right? And why that was let go, right? And then to our non-Christian, but here our Jewish brothers and sisters share many of our principles as well. So how do you have those conversations? And then to those in more of a secular, progressive mindset, how do you approach? How do you talk to them? And you gave many different ways today, and I came in loaded. I got lots of papers in front of me, but the Spirit of God wanted us to have a different conversation and maybe approach, and we can always come back,
Yes.
and in notes you can always, as you always do, you can put links, to all the other consequences and all the things, and people can ask questions.
Yeah.
And then we can come back and have a talk.
Leave your questions in the comments, please. No, this was really good, because I'm a philosophy major, I love natural reason. And I've just found that, especially in today's day and age where everything is so chaotic, and a lot of people don't have religion, or they have really confused ideas of religion,
Right.
being able to kind of work from the ground up with issues like this is incredibly helpful. I remember being at a winery one time, and this woman turned to me, and she was probably about 15 years older than me. And I was with a friend, and she's like, girls, don't ever use birth control. And she's like, they lied to my generation, and it really messed with me. And she was talking about the health problems, but it was just this moment of oh yeah, I could have we could completely agree on a conversation right now about the problems with hormonal birth control, and then
Right.
how do you take that and walk it just to the next level. And yeah, it's just really, really helpful to be able to talk to people in today's age who may not accept the church says this is wrong, therefore you must obey, but really be able to be okay, this goes against natural reason, this goes against the natural act of sex, this goes against your health or your relationship or these different things. And that's how you lead people to truth, is meeting them where they're
Exactly.
at. This is what they can accept right now.
That's right.
And you help them accept it, and then you just keep walking them
And
up.
that's the beauty of the great teaching of John Paul with the theology of the body. He's approaching it from those philosophical questions and then answering them and responding to them.
Well, and even Humanae Vitae strikes me as it's so reasonable.
It is.
It's this, if you accept this is what happens. If you allow a husband and wife to do it, nations are going to use it against their own citizens.
Exactly.
He draws things to their logical conclusion, and he's not just coming in and saying, the church has always taught contraception's wrong, therefore it's wrong, and end of story.
Right.
It's the church has always taught contraception is wrong. Here's why. And
being able to ask when someone says, well, I'm opposed to it. Well, what are you opposed to in the document? What is it that you disagree with? And ultimately, they just disagree with the church's teaching on contraception. It's an interesting thing, because the document itself on human life is so beautiful. It's so rich. And it approaches it, or 1 + 1 = 2. This is what happens. And so I think it is very important to keep having these conversations. And I think it's very good, Colleen, that as you're doing, bringing other people from different other kind of ways of approachment, so that you actually then have a whole conversation, and it's great for people. And I think that's wonderful that the lady said that, because it must have stirred up a conversation, not only in that moment, must have let people out of there going, that was an interesting conversation or discussion, kind of thing. But it makes people think. And I can tell you, and I'll just close with this, is that most men who have been honest, who have asked me the question about the issue of contraception, especially married men, it says, my wife has been asking me to talk to you about this. And you talk to them, I would say almost all of the time, it's fear. It's fear of the unknowns. And once you begin to now most times these are men that are Catholic, they're Christian men. They may not necessarily be practicing, but they're fully and wholly. But you can bring them in this way. This is how you bring them back, actually. And the realization of how they can learn to love their wives more than they ever thought they could. And for them to be loved by their wives in ways they never thought they could. And to see what union really means and what being one really means. And that's why the book from Catholic Answers, Inseparable, is so important, because it really is inseparable. But contraception does rupture. So maybe that's a good way to...
Oh, that's a great way to close off this conversation. So thank you so much, Father.
Oh, thank you, Colleen.
Like I said to our audience, please leave any questions you have on this topic in the comments, and Father and I can come back and hopefully answer some of those in a future episode. So thank you, Father.
Thank you, Colleen.
And to all of our listeners, please follow, subscribe, check out the new ebooks that we have coming out. I'll link our one on contraception and how it creates an abortion culture on the end screen here and put it in the description. And keep on living the culture of life. God bless.